Hey guys, tonight we glide silently through water that doesn't quite look like water, not because it's dirty, though, let's be real, it kind of is in places, but because it looks like Earth. You're not quite on land, but you're not on a lake either. Around you, thick mats of green stretch outward, studded with vegetables, flowers, and maybe a dog or two curled up under a fig tree. Somewhere far off, the hum of a boat engine echoes, but here, in the early morning mist, it's just you, the ducks, and the memory of an empire. Welcome to Xochimilco, one of the last places on Earth where you can float across farmland built by the Aztecs more than 700 years ago, and somehow still in use. You're literally gliding over floating gardens. Floating gardens. Built by people who didn't even have iron tools, yet figured out how to farm on a lake while most of Europe was still figuring out how to bathe regularly. Geographers still argue whether the chinampas, the artificial islands we're exploring, should be called floating at all, since they're actually tethered to the lakebed with tree roots. But hey, if the ground beneath you squishes when you step, and your cornfield rocks ever so slightly when someone paddles by, you have every right to call it floating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you. I always love seeing how far these journeys travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting in a small wooden boat low in the water. The man paddling is quiet. He doesn't say much unless you ask, and even then it's with the slow rhythm of someone used to watching morning unfold in water ripples instead of screens. His boat smells like damp wood and leaves. You pass under an arch draped in bougainvillea, probably from the time of Porfirio Diaz, and suddenly everything narrows. On both sides, raised beds of earth emerge just above water level, their borders held by reeds and tree roots. Willows lean protectively over the channels, their long fingers combing the breeze. Ducks waddle on the edges, and marigolds bloom in perfectly spaced rows. Because yes, they plant flowers here too, not just food. Your guide points out the milpas, plots growing maize, and the distinct grouping of crops that echoes Aztec agricultural genius. That genius is inescapable. You're surrounded by what scholars still call one of the most efficient and sustainable farming systems ever developed. Without tractors, without chemicals, without TikTok tutorials, the Mexica, often called the Aztecs, engineered an empire atop a lake. They dredged mud from the bottom, layered it with lake weeds, fenced it with wooden stakes, and anchored it all with fast-growing trees, like the ahuejote, a type of willow that seems designed by nature to hold secrets. And still, here you are, floating, on their work. The air smells like wet greenery and old earth. Occasionally you'll spot a heron, or hear the surreal chirp of an axolotl, though spotting one is rare. There's a rhythmic piece to it, like the land is breathing in water time. And yes, that sounds like the kind of thing someone says right before charging you $15 for organic kale. But here, it feels true. You pass another boat. An older woman sits inside, carefully arranging stalks of celery and amaranth. Her eyes meet yours for a moment, and she smiles. Not a tourist smile, but the kind you give someone who's decided to step off the pavement for a while. Then she's gone, absorbed by reeds and reflection. By now, you notice how quiet it really is here. Even when there's sound, paddles slapping, birds cackling, a dog barking in the distance, it's muffled, absorbed into the thick, damp air like secrets sinking into wet soil. And there's something else you might feel. A slight unease. Not fear exactly, but that timeless weight of being in a place where too many stories happened all at once. The Spanish arrived here by boat. Revolutions whispered through these trees. Even lovers hid in these canals, long before Instagrammable gondola rides became a thing. And through it all, the chinampas held. They didn't march, they didn't cry, they just floated, planted, waited. Geographers still argue whether the current chinampas are authentic, how much of the original system is preserved, and how much has been patchworked with modern methods. But to the fish beneath you and the marigolds beside you, the debate probably sounds like splashy nonsense. You reach a wider channel. Your guide stops paddling. He lets the boat drift, nose first, into a stand of lilies. A dragonfly lands on your knee. Above you, the sun is finally starting to cut through the haze. The light doesn't flood in, it trickles, soft and gold and slow. It slides along the water's surface like it's afraid to break anything. This is where the story begins. A lake that's part city. A city that floats on farming. A world that still lives quietly, long after its empire fell. You lean back. A willow brushes your shoulder. The water doesn't rock so much as sigh. Let's keep drifting. The boat noses forward again, paddle dipping back into rhythm. The channels narrow and widen at irregular intervals, like a system designed more by feeling than by rulers. And honestly, that's not far from the truth. You're gliding through the remnants of an engineering marvel crafted by people who didn't have drafting tables, blueprints, or CAD software. Just mud, plants, and centuries of accumulated intuition. Picture this. It's the 1300s. The Mexica, later known as the Aztecs, arrive in the Valley of Mexico. And what do they find? A soggy, marshy basin surrounded by volcanoes and bad real estate advice. The land is either underwater or too salty to grow much of anything. And yet, instead of leaving, they settle. Because apparently, when an eagle perches on a cactus holding a snake, you don't second-guess the symbolism, you build a capital city. That city? Tenochtitlan, built right in the middle of Lake Texcoco. And no, that's not a metaphor. They literally built a metropolis on water. And they didn't do it with dams or fill dirt, but with something far more beautiful and weirdly squishy: chinampas. Here's the fun part. The Aztecs didn't just carve out land, they created it. They started by staking out a rectangular frame in the shallow lake. Then they piled up alternating layers of aquatic vegetation, like water hyacinths and reeds, mixed with lake-bottom mud. This stack eventually formed a floating mat of soil thick enough to grow crops. And to keep the whole thing from drifting into a neighbour's radish patch, they planted willow trees at the corners. These roots burrowed down into the lake bed, tethering the chinampa like a polite plant-based anchor. Geographers still argue whether chinampas evolved from earlier Mesoamerican farming, or if they were a sudden burst of innovation specific to the Mexica. Either way, it's a case study in sustainable ingenuity. No need for crop rotation, minimal erosion, continuous harvests. And the best part? Your lake becomes your irrigation system. It's like building a floating pantry and fridge in one, and no HOA fees. As your boat coasts alongside one of these ancient rafts, your guide gestures toward the embankment. The slope from water to field is gentle, mossy, deliberate. In some places, remnants of original retaining walls peek through, woven reedwork still clinging to a muddy spine after centuries. Think about that. Wood and reeds surviving floods, conquest, urban sprawl, and more than a few drunk mariachi parties. You're now passing a narrow gap, a slit in the chinampa edge, just wide enough to slip a paddle through. That's an acequia, a water channel used to distribute moisture to the crops. The Aztecs didn't just rely on rainfall, they used controlled flooding to nurture their gardens. Some scholars say this made their system nearly drought-proof. Others debate whether the salinity of Lake Texcoco eventually compromised the setup. Either way, they made it work for longer than most modern farming methods. A breeze rustles the trees. You look up and spot a great egret, standing completely still on one foot, doing its best Zen monk impression. Behind it, a flock of black-crowned night herons nests in the willow branches. Even now, the biodiversity of these wetlands would impress a National Geographic photographer, if you could get them to put down their coffee and get in the boat. You notice something now. The geometry of the place. The chinampas are long and narrow, often about 30 metres long and 2.5 metres wide. Just the right size for maintenance by canoe. That's no accident. The Aztecs weren't just randomly stacking dirt. They were optimizing for human hands and small boats. Everything here was scaled to the body, to the rhythm of rowing, planting, harvesting, returning. And if you think that sounds romantic, remember this. The whole system supported a city of over 200,000 people, larger than any European city at the time. That's a lot of squash, and corn, and, believe it or not, chili peppers, because even ancient empires needed spice. You float past a chinampa that still grows cempasúchil, those bright orange marigolds used during Dia de los Muertos. They're planted in tight rows, glowing like fire in the slanting morning light. These flowers weren't just decorative. They were spiritual, medical, and sometimes edible, depending on who you asked. And that blend of utility and beauty, that's pure chinampa design. Every element here serves more than one purpose. And you, drifting silently between these green corridors, feel it. A low hum of continuity, a system too elegant to disappear. Even the soil smells like memory. Rich, wet, vegetal, slightly bitter, like history never fully dried. Your guide clears his throat for the first time in 20 minutes. He says something in Spanish. Aquí, todo sigue. Here, everything continues, and maybe that's what makes chinampas different. They don't just exist, they persist, quietly, resiliently. While empires fell, while cities sank, while streets were paved and neon signs rose, these gardens kept growing. You reach a bend in the canal, the boat turns, the wind carries the scent of something fresh, cilantro maybe, or mint, hard to tell through the water haze. But one thing is clear. You're not in ruins, you're in a system still alive, still whispering, still engineering, without blueprints. The boat slows again as your guide leans forward to steer it toward a tighter canal. On either side, the land rises only inches above the water, but the density of growth makes it feel like a solid world. Corn stalks brush the sky in thin rows. Beneath them, squash vines tangle and spread across the soil like lazy serpents. Somewhere in between, bean plants stretch upward, curling around stalks as if reaching for forgotten sunlight. This isn't just farming, it's architecture, and you're floating through one of its quiet cathedrals. This is the heart of chinampa construction, and tonight you get to see how the Aztecs built floating farmland by hand, and by mud. It's not glamorous, but it is genius. You try to imagine it now, a lake so shallow that you can wade in up to your knees for half a kilometre, its bottom carpeted in soft sludge. You see the first layer, a frame of wooden stakes driven deep into the lake bed, tied together with reeds or branches to mark the rectangle of a new chinampa. Then comes the layering. Sediment from the lake bottom, thick and nutrient-rich, is dredged up and mixed with decaying vegetation. This mucky cocktail is stacked into the frame, slowly building mass. It smells like old fish and damp leaves. Not the most appealing cologne, but rich in nitrogen. Over time, as the layers settle and compact, the island takes shape. Willow trees, ahuejotes, are planted along the edges, their roots both anchoring the structure and preventing erosion. These trees, with their lanky limbs and drooping leaves, are guardians of the chinampas. They soak up excess water during floods and stabilize the soil during droughts. They even provide a bit of shade and wood when needed. Basically, they're the unsung heroes of lake-based agriculture. Give them a slow clap. Quietly though, it's almost midnight. Geographers still argue whether the chinampa system qualifies as hydroponic. Technically, the crops grow in soil, not water, but the water's constant proximity and the capillary action pulling moisture up into the roots makes the whole system behave like something out of a modern greenhouse. It's low-tech, high-efficiency farming with a flair for soggy drama. At this point, your guide reaches down and pulls up a chunk of the edge, not to destroy it, but to show you what lies beneath. You see layers of sediment, almost like the rings of a tree, each telling a story of season, harvest, or flood. You half expect him to pull out a fish skeleton and date it with carbon isotopes. Instead, he smiles and lets the clump drop back into the water, where it plops like a whispered punctuation mark. Every chinampa is bordered by narrow canals. These weren't just for water access. They were ancient highways. Farmers once paddled through them daily, trading produce and stories. Crops would be loaded into trajineras, flat-bottomed boats, and paddled to markets in Tenochtitlan. Think of it as the OG farmers' market, but with more reed hats and fewer smoothie samples. And the structure of the gardens is always strategic. The long, narrow design maximizes the number of plants, that can be reached by hand from a canoe. That's a key point. Everything was designed for canoe scale. No tractors, no industrial spreaders, just humans, paddles, and the occasional axolotl sighting. You glance down into the water now. It's murky, but not filthy. Bits of green drift across the surface. Duckweed, algae, maybe a wayward tomato leaf. Insects skate the water like tiny figure skaters. A fish darts below the boat and vanishes into a pocket of shadow. The whole ecosystem is humming along at a pace too slow for clocks, but too persistent to ignore. And here's a quirky fact for you. Chinampas weren't just used for crops. Some were gardens, others were graveyards. A few even hosted small shrines or rest huts, where farmers could nap under the willows or offer cornmeal to the gods. Occasionally, archaeologists still find broken clay figurines buried in the soil, tokens left behind as offerings, or maybe just toys forgotten by a child on lunch break. As the boat drifts beside one of the larger islands, you notice rows of flowers planted between vegetables. At first glance, it seems decorative, but there's method behind the beauty. Flowers like cempasúchil and dahlias act as natural pest repellents. Others attract pollinators. Some are simply planted because they smell nice, which, let's be honest, is a perfectly valid reason, especially when you're surrounded by mud and lake breath. Geographers still debate how much of the original chinampa system survives today. Estimates range wildly, from a few dozen pure chinampas still in use to hundreds of hybrid versions that blend old techniques with modern touches like netting and hose irrigation. But even in modified form, the principles remain. Work with the water, not against it. Grow your land from the bottom up, and let your vegetables float. The sun is higher now, but the light is still soft, filtered through the willows and scattered by mist. You lean your hand over the side of the boat and trail your fingers in the canal. The water is surprisingly warm, silky, alive. And then a dragonfly lands on your thumb and stays there, completely unbothered. In a world obsessed with fast, the chinampa whispers, grow slow, float steady, stay rooted, even when the land doesn't. You pass a bend in the canal, and the world opens up again. This time, there's a broader stretch of water, and beyond it, rows of towering corn framed against the hazy light, their golden tassels swaying like sleepy flags. Interspersed are the squat forms of squash vines, with their wide, flat leaves catching stray beams of sunlight, and snaking up through it all are lean stalks of beans, wrapping their tendrils around the corn in a gentle embrace. It's more than just a garden. It's a pattern, a partnership, a perfect triangle of nourishment known across the Americas as the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. If you've ever wondered how the Aztecs managed to feed a massive empire from floating farmland, well, this is the secret handshake. Corn grows tall and acts as a natural pole for the beans to climb. Beans in turn fix nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for their companions, and squash sprawls low to the ground, shielding the soil from sunlight and keeping moisture in. It's like watching a group of close friends who instinctively fill each other's gaps, without drama or group chats or unread message guilt. But here's the twist. This trio wasn't just an agricultural hack. It was spiritual. These crops were gifts from the gods, literal deities in the Aztec worldview. Sentiotl, god of maize, was honoured during planting and harvest. Beans and squash too had ceremonial roles, often part of offerings or woven into oral traditions. You pass a chinampa where rows of chili peppers shimmer in the heat, their colours bright, greens, reds, yellows like miniature flames. A few amaranth plants stand tall nearby, their feathery plumes waving like fireworks. Amaranth was another sacred food, used in rituals, shaped into figurines, sometimes smeared with blood. Though let's not think too hard about that while drifting peacefully. Geographers still argue whether the Aztecs grew such diverse crops on every chinampa or rotated certain ones seasonally, but archaeological digs suggest astonishing variety. Tomatoes, avocados, even cacao in small amounts, though cacao was more often imported from warmer southern zones and used like currency. That's right, the beans that make chocolate once paid for market goods, and maybe even bribes. A civilization that used chocolate as money? Honestly, respect. Your guide pulls the boat close to a plot thick with squash. He says something quietly, something about how some farmers today still plant in la forma antigua, the old way. No machines, no fertilizers, just seeds, water, hands and luck. And luck, it seems, wasn't something left entirely to chance. The Aztecs weren't just practical, they were deeply superstitious. Before planting, it was customary to offer prayers or even small tokens, obsidian chips, feathers, or ground maize to the gods of fertility and earth. Some farmers today still toss a few kernels into the canal before planting, just in case the old gods are still watching. You can almost imagine it now, the early morning silence broken by whispered chants, a canoe nudging through mist, fingers scattering corn into black water. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because even when you engineer your own land from mud, you still understand that nature is the boss, and nature, famously, has moods. A duck flaps noisily nearby, splashing a little water into the boat. Your guide chuckles. You consider splashing it back, but decide against starting a bird war. Beyond the Three Sisters and chili peppers, the Aztecs also grew medicinal herbs on their chinampas, epazote, quelites, tlalchichi, plants whose names now sound like music and whose uses ranged from digestive cures to spiritual cleansings. Some were steeped into teas, others ground into pastes. Some were smoked or burned like incense. The line between food and medicine was fluid, much like the land here. And here's a quirky detail for you. Some chinampas were used not to grow crops, but to grow worms and algae. Yes, algae. Aztec farmers harvested spirulina, a green, protein-rich paste that they dried and baked into cakes. Think of it as the original power bar, but with more paddle splashing. You're passing a quieter stretch now. No tourists, no houses, just chinampa after chinampa, some pristine, others abandoned, overgrown with grass and papyrus. One even has a goat standing on it, completely unbothered, chewing its way through what looks like a pile of wilted dandelions. The goat glances at you. You nod back. A moment is shared. These gardens don't shout. They hum, a low, steady note of balance and patience. Geographers still debate how many people a single chinampa could feed. Some say as few as 2 families. Others argue dozens, especially when combined with other lake resources like fish, frogs and waterfowl. But either way, the takeaway's the same. In a world of crumbling soils and food deserts, here was a system that turned water into food with almost no waste, and it did so for centuries. The boat floats forward again. A woman on a nearby chinampa waves. She's kneeling among the bean plants, planting something new. You wave back. She smiles, then returns to the soil, hands disappearing into the dark earth as if she's drawing energy from it. And maybe she is. Maybe, tonight, we all are. The canal ahead narrows again, flanked by dense clusters of maize so tall they block out the sun for a moment. The light slips in sideways through the leaves, creating a moving pattern across the boat floor, like a slow, breathing mosaic. The air changes too, cooler, wetter. You pull your shoulders in slightly, not because it's cold, but because the presence of the past feels a bit heavier here. It's hard to believe now, gliding through this hushed green world, but once upon a time this entire lake basin was bursting with energy. Chanting priests, trading canoes, floating gardens for as far as the eye could see. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, sat at the center of it all like a stone lotus, its causeways fanning outward across Lake Texcoco, and surrounding it, a shimmering web of chinampas that fed its people and framed its power. But here's the thing about cities, they don't know when to stop growing. The same genius that allowed the Aztecs to build a floating empire also led to its slow entanglement with its own ambition. You can feel that tension here, under your boat, where the layers of soil sometimes feel too deep, too overbuilt, too heavy to float forever. As the population grew, so did the demand for food. The chinampa network expanded outward from the original lake center, creeping across the shallows like slow, muddy lightning. The fields reached toward the shoreline, pushing into the wetlands, then into the fragile spaces where land turned to marsh. The Aztecs began building more causeways, aqueducts and canals, each addition a marvel, and each one a further blurring of the line between land and lake. Geographers still argue whether this rapid expansion was sustainable. Some say the Aztecs mastered ecological balance, others believe they were pushing their environment to its limits, and that the signs of collapse were already showing before the Spanish arrived. Soil salinization, crop fatigue, a lake growing shallow and stubborn, a city too large for its roots. Your guide paddles past a crumbling section of canal wall. It's overgrown with wild grass and moss, but you can still see the structure beneath. Woven reeds and stone. A small, sunken shrine sits there too, half submerged, weathered by centuries of water and silence. It looks like the kind of place you'd leave an offering if you weren't entirely convinced the gods had stopped listening. And about those gods, this was never just agriculture, it was cosmology. The chinampas system was tied into the Aztec calendar, the phases of the moon, the positions of stars. Farmers didn't just watch the sky for weather, they watched for meaning. Every seed had a ritual, every harvest had a chant, even the irrigation channels followed symbolic alignments. To plant here was to speak with the universe, politely, in full sentences, and preferably while wearing a feathered headdress. You pass a bird, maybe a purple gallinule, maybe just an unusually fashionable chicken perched on a half-submerged beam. It hops into the water and paddles away like it has a meeting to get to. You wonder if it knows it's gliding over a ghost city. Beneath you lies what used to be a capital larger than Paris or London in its time. Tenochtitlan wasn't just impressive for the 1400s, it would have been impressive today. It had running water, trash collection, botanical gardens, libraries, and it all worked in harmony with the chinampas. Food came in fresh daily from the lakeside gardens by canoe, delivered by farmers whose grandkids still paddle these same canals. And then, the boats stopped coming. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they saw the floating gardens and the Great Lake City, and like true colonizers, they immediately thought, this would look better paved. During the conquest, fighting spilled into the canals. Chinampas were burned, flooded, destroyed. The Spanish tore down temples, drained portions of the lake, and eventually began reshaping the entire valley into dry, rigid land. They didn't understand the system, so they dismantled it. And just like that, the city that had grown from water began to suffocate in dust. Your boat glides past a chinampa that looks abandoned, just a skeleton of its former shape. The trees still stand, but the soil is patchy. Weeds rule here. And yet, there's something alive in it. Even in decay, the structure holds. That's the secret of chinampas. Even when forgotten, they don't vanish. They wait. Geographers still wonder whether a fully restored chinampa system could support modern urban life again. Could this ancient model feed parts of Mexico City today? Could it cool the microclimate, filter water, even rehouse forgotten species? A few pilot projects suggest yes. Others raise concerns about pollution, land rights, bureaucracy, the usual modern anchors. But you don't feel all that as you float here. What you feel is that strange mix of mourning and wonder. You're surrounded by the remains of a system too good to die and too quiet to shout. It didn't collapse so much as fade, like a lake drying at the edges unnoticed until the dust gets into your lungs. You pass under a low bridge, its stone crusted with moss and graffiti. On the other side, the light changes again. Warmer now. Gold, reflecting off water that once mirrored a city of temples and gardens, and maybe, just maybe, still does. The canal straightens again, narrowing between two long chinampas that seem to reach endlessly ahead. To your right, tomato vines hang heavy with fruit, plump, glossy sun-warmed orbs that look like they were painted on. Some are bright red, others still blushing toward ripeness. To your left, the tops of avocado trees peak above a hedgerow of sunflowers, and somewhere beneath it all, hidden in the folds of loam and history, the gods are still listening. Tonight, you floated far enough to realize the familiar things around you are ancient. You know tomatoes, you've seen avocados, but floating here, surrounded by their wild, tangled ancestors, you realize they didn't always belong to the world. They belonged first to this lake, these gardens, and these people. Tomatoes especially carry a strange sort of legacy. Native to this region, they were once revered, cultivated, and cautiously consumed. In Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, the word was zitamatl, meaning plump thing with a navel. Accurate, slightly uncomfortable, deeply lovable, and they weren't red at first either. The early tomatoes were small, yellow-orange, and slightly bitter. It was only after European conquest that they mutated into the global obsession you now smother on fries and fold into pizza sauce. But back here, in Xochimilco, tomatoes still cling to their roots, literally and symbolically. They grow from earth shaped by hand, watered by canals dug with paddles, and watched over by the same sun that once warmed Aztec emperors. It's funny how the world has changed around them. They were once thought poisonous in Europe. Now, they're $3.99 a pound unless you catch a sale. You drift past a plot of land where tomato vines grow in raised beds, camelones, lined with sun-bleached wooden boards. Bees zigzag lazily across the blossoms. Your guide plucks a ripe one and hands it to you without a word. It's warm, slightly cracked at the top, and impossibly fragrant. You bite into it and it tastes nothing like the supermarket. It tastes like river water and sun, like mud and summer secrets. Geographers still argue whether the original Xochimilco tomatoes were bred more for flavour or resilience. Some say their bitterness was prized for medicinal use. Others point to food preparation practices. Aztec cuisine involved drying, roasting, even fermenting, that would have transformed the taste long before tomatoes went mainstream. But you don't need a theory. You have juice on your chin and seeds in your teeth. That's enough evidence. You glide farther into the quiet. A low mist has begun to settle just above the water's surface. It moves slowly, curling around tree roots and rising in delicate puffs when the paddle dips. You spot a heron standing knee-deep at the far edge of a chinampa, unmoving, its reflection blurring in the ripple. And just as you're about to ask about that bird, your guide says, almost offhandedly, El dios del maíz tenía una hermana, la diosa del tomate. The god of maize had a sister, the goddess of tomatoes. You blink. That wasn't in your school textbook. Turns out, Aztec mythology treated food not just as sustenance, but as sacred family. Corn and tomato, siblings, balanced, intertwined. Tomatoes weren't a side dish, they were part of the divine household, complete with festivals, prayers, and symbolic offerings. Some believed their red colour linked them to the life force, Tonali, and others connected their roundness to celestial cycles. And then there's the chili. Oh yes, the chili. A few plots ahead, rows of chilhuacal and pasilla peppers hang from low plants like glowing ornaments. The air carries their scent, earthy, sweet, with the faintest tickle of spice. You can feel it in your nose before you taste it in your mouth. Chilies were everything to the Aztecs. Flavour, medicine, punishment. Children were sometimes scolded with smoke made from burning chili, effective if not exactly therapeutic, and warriors carried dried chilies as part of their field rations. Geographers, and maybe child psychologists, still argue whether this constituted mild trauma or early culinary training. You smile to yourself. Somewhere out there, a young Aztec boy sneezes from a chili ritual and grows up to invent salsa. As you float between chinampas still heavy with edible offerings, it becomes clear that nothing here is casual. Every plant has purpose. Every garden is a sentence in a long poem whispered by people who believed that the land didn't belong to them. It spoke to them. And now, centuries later, the whisper remains. A soft breeze stirs the mist. The willows sway. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then stops. You spot a row of pumpkins, round and dusty orange, nestled like sleeping suns between long rows of herbs. A small scarecrow stands nearby, its clothes patched, its hat crooked, its job eternal. Everything here grows close together. There's no wasted space. You realise that the chinampa is more than a field. It's a system of intimate relationships. Corn shelters beans, tomatoes anchor shallow-rooted herbs. Squash guards the soil. And peppers, those mischievous little fire starters, keep pests and spirits alike on their best behaviour. You pass under a willow again. This one leans lower, as if listening to your thoughts. Its roots disappear into the water, into the past, into the silt of centuries. You reach out and touch its bark as you drift by. Rough, cool, very much alive. The mist thickens slightly, a veil drawn slowly over a stage, and still the gardens bloom. Still the goddess of tomatoes smiles quietly from between the leaves. Not in statue, not in story, but in taste, in seed, in soil that remembers her name. The paddle dips again, breaking the silence with a quiet slap of water. The mist rises a little as the sun climbs behind it, turning the canal ahead into a shimmering ribbon of gold and blue-grey. You lean forward just slightly, watching the bank shift and curve. The chinampas keep appearing, one after another, each one a stitched patch in a vast green quilt that somehow is still being sown. But now something else creeps into view. Ruins. Not the grand romantic kind with moss-covered temples and birds circling overhead. These are quieter, sadder, collapsed fences, overgrown paths, half-submerged plots where the trees lean at wrong angles and the soil seems tired. There's a broken canoe, rotting at the edge of a reed bed. Its ribs curl like old parchment. You've drifted into the part of the gardens where the past refused to fully fade, but the future didn't quite make it either. This is where the chinampas became battlegrounds. After the Spanish arrived, this landscape, once so carefully cultivated, so deeply spiritual, was shattered. The conquest of Tenochtitlan didn't just bring down temples and rulers. It brought fire, flood, and then bureaucracy. The chinampas were torched by the Spaniards as they pressed deeper into the Aztec heartland. Canals were choked to block retreat. Trees were cut. Entire plots were flooded, not for irrigation, but for siege. Geographers still argue whether the destruction was tactical or symbolic. Was it easier to destroy the food system to starve the city? Or was it a deliberate erasure, an attempt to wipe clean a way of life that had no place in colonial vision? Either way, the land bled. You pass a chinampa now that's been reclaimed by nature. The reeds have risen higher than your head. The rows are gone, replaced by wild tangle. But look closely. Beneath the mess, you can still see the outline of structure, the bones of something that refuses to vanish. The lake that once held this world began to change too. The Spanish, uncomfortable with so much standing water, began draining it. Over time, whole portions of Lake Texcoco were converted into farmland, roads, and eventually neighborhoods. What was once a massive web of chinampas feeding the largest city in the Americas shrank and withered. Your guide points to a distant bank, barely visible through the trees. All that used to be water, he says. You blink. You're floating over the last threads of a woven empire. But not all was lost. Some of the chinampas held on, kept alive by families who refused to leave the water. Generations of chinamperos passed their plots down like whispered secrets. These weren't just gardens anymore. They were resistance. During Mexico's wars for independence, rebels sometimes used the canals to move unnoticed. During the Revolution, chinamperos fed their communities when markets collapsed. And during the industrial boom of the 20th century, when Mexico City paved and climbed and choked on its own concrete, the gardens remained quiet, patient, sinking slightly but never drowning. You spot an old cross nailed to a tree, weather-worn, tilting, a marker for someone or something that lived and worked and never left. Here's something curious. Geographers still debate whether the term floating gardens was ever quite accurate. Some say it was a poetic invention of the Spanish, stunned by what they saw. Others insist the name came from indigenous traditions. Either way, it stuck, and maybe it doesn't matter. Floating or not, they're still here, and that's the miracle. As you pass another broken fence, a sound rises from across the water. Thwack, thwack, thwack. A machete. Someone's clearing brush. The rhythm is steady, purposeful. Even here, where everything seems half asleep, someone's still fighting to keep a chinampa alive. You pause. There's something powerful about hearing work in the distance. Proof of life. The gardens might be bruised, might even be limping, but they're still breathing. And breathing, you realise, is its own kind of resistance. A heron flaps across the canal, low and slow, wings outstretched like velvet fans. Its shadow skims the water's surface. For a moment, everything is quiet again, as if the land, the birds, the old gods, and even the ghosts agree. This place may not roar, but it remembers. Up ahead, the mist starts to thin. The boat turns, and slowly, like a curtain parting, you begin to see the living side of Xochimilco again. Gardens that are neat, canoes tied carefully to tree roots, smoke rising from a small cooking fire. Life, not just memory. But we're not quite there yet. There's more story in the silence, and more silence in the story. The boat eases back into clearer water, gliding past a grove of willow trees whose branches trail like fingers into the canal. Your guide doesn't paddle for a moment, just lets the boat drift, guided by the water's own slow will. The chinampas around you are vibrant again, rows of crops in clean patterns, sunflowers standing guard at the edges, trellises arching overhead with climbing vines. It's peaceful, but you can feel the hidden logic behind every detail. And now, you start to wonder something simple but strange. If these gardens are called floating, why don't they actually float? You reach down and touch the soil at the edge of one chinampa. It's firm, springy, sure, but not drifting. This isn't a raft. It doesn't bob like a boat. Turns out, the floating part of the floating gardens is a bit of a poetic exaggeration. Geographers still argue whether the term was ever literal. The truth? Chinampas were built on the shallow lake bottom, their layers stacked up until they rose above the waterline, anchored by those famous willow trees, the ahuejotes. So while the crops might look like they're growing on little islands drifting lazily across the lake, the truth is a lot more rooted, literally. Those willows, silent, green, slightly droopy, are key. They don't just provide shade, their deep root systems tie the whole chinampa down like threads in a fabric. They stabilize the soil, help prevent erosion, and, some believe, they even communicate. No, seriously. Some biologists now think trees like these exchange nutrients and signals underground through a fungal network. It's called the wood wide web, and if that isn't the most delightful term in modern ecology, I don't know what is. Imagine that. A secret conversation happening beneath the mud, one chinampa to another. The Aztecs, of course, wouldn't have described it in those terms, but they knew the system worked. They knew that these trees and beds, the water and the silt, the wind and the stars, it all had to move in harmony. You couldn't just slap some corn on a floating mat and call it a day. The chinampa was a living system. As you pass by a particularly lush chinampa, your guide stops the boat and points to something barely visible just beneath the water's surface, a kind of underwater fence, stakes woven with reeds, submerged just below the canal. These were the ancient barriers keeping soil from sliding away and marking the edges between plots. They're old, some possibly hundreds of years, and still doing their job like it's just another Tuesday. You might expect a place like this to creak under the weight of its age. But instead, it flexes, adjusts. The gardens are rooted, yes, but they're also adaptive. Case in point, the changing water levels. Modern Xochimilco faces water problems all the time. Mexico City, the massive metropolis that now sits atop the drained remains of Lake Texcoco, is thirsty. Water is pumped up from aquifers, and the old lake basin sinks a little more each year. The canals are shallower than they used to be. The ecosystem is more fragile, and yet the chinampas adjust. Some farmers now raise their plots slightly higher. Others add new tree roots or reshape the beds to channel rain more effectively. It's a bit like gardening on a slowly deflating air mattress. You learn to work with the squish. And through all this, the gardens still hold. Your guide begins paddling again, slow and easy. The boat slides past a chinampa where a man and woman are tying bean plants to a wooden frame. Their movements are synchronized. The man wraps twine around the stalks. The woman pats the soil down around the base. A chicken pecks at something near their feet, unconcerned with human ceremony. There's something soothing about watching people who clearly know what they're doing. No wasted motion, no checking phones, just rhythm and focus and dirt under the fingernails. You start to get it now, why these chinampas are called floating. Not because they physically drift, but because they feel like they exist on the edge of this world and some other. They don't quite belong to the past. They're not fully of the present either. They float in time. Geographers still argue how much longer Xochimilco's chinampas can survive. Some say climate change and urban pressure will finally push them out. Others point to the new wave of ecological farming, education programs, and ecotourism as signs of rebirth. But anyone who visits quickly learns one thing. You don't bet against something that survived fire, conquest, concrete, and karaoke boats full of tequila. You round a bend, and there it is. Another canal stretching ahead, straight as a ruler, its banks perfectly trimmed. A pair of ducks swim beside you, leaving twin ripples that gently rock your boat. The light reflects off the water now in soft pulses, gold, blue, green. You lean back, and the willows above sway with you. The boat glides, the garden breathes, and the past, it turns out, was never buried. It was planted. The boat slips into a quieter channel now, narrow and lined with vegetation so dense it almost brushes your shoulders as you pass. On either side, the chinampas feel closer together, less like farmland, more like alleyways of greenery. You start to picture what life here must have been like when the canals were as busy as streets, and canoes were the pickup trucks of their time. Welcome to the world of the canoe commute. The Aztecs didn't just farm these gardens. They lived with them, travelled through them, traded along them. Picture a city where your commute to work involves paddling between rows of corn, where your neighbours float by with baskets of squash, where every errand includes a side of lily pads and the occasional frog chorus. And no one was honking. At its peak, this network of water roads connected the chinampas not just to each other, but to the heart of Tenochtitlan. Food grown out here could be delivered fresh to the city centre daily. Maize, herbs, flowers, fish. Even fresh water was ferried in from the springs of Chapultepec through aqueducts and, yes, boats. It was a supply chain with no engines, no exhaust, and zero traffic jams, unless a particularly wide canoe got stuck turning between tight canals, which probably led to some very polite Aztec muttering. As you glide on, your guide points out a split in the canal, one side blocked by water hyacinths, the other shaded by overgrown bamboo. You drift left, and suddenly the trees thin, revealing a clearing where two men are standing knee-deep in water, dredging the canal by hand. They're pulling up silt with wide baskets, moving in rhythm, the water sloshing up to their waists. It's ancient, back-breaking work, but it keeps the canals alive. Geographers still argue whether the dredging of canals was done on a strict rotational system or more as needed. But either way, the idea was simple. Remove the sediment before it clogs the water flow, and then reuse it to enrich the soil on the chinampas. Nothing was wasted. Not the mud, not the water, not even, brace yourself, the excrement. Yes. The Aztecs had an early sanitation system that included collecting human waste, composting it with vegetation, and using it as fertilizer. And you were worried about a little lake mud under your fingernails. That said, this system required cooperation. The farmers had to coordinate dredging, planting, harvesting, and even canal cleaning. And in a society without email chains, that meant something more impressive. Actual face-to-face diplomacy. You didn't want to be the guy who blocked your neighbour's canal, or didn't dredge your share of the waterway. That sort of thing could lead to some very awkward moments at the market, and possibly a passive-aggressive note carved in obsidian. The truth is, everything about the chinampa system depended on community. You couldn't do it alone. The land didn't just float. It linked. Families worked in tandem. Knowledge was shared, not hoarded, and when disputes arose, they were usually settled on the water, canoe to canoe. You can imagine two men facing off, each standing at the front of his boat, oar in hand, not to duel, but to negotiate the placement of a shared compost pile, or the border between chili plots. You float past a chinampa that looks almost staged in its perfection. The rows are clean, the trees are trimmed. A hammock swings lazily between two willows. A dog lifts its head to watch you pass. then flops back down with a groan of someone who has already seen too much. Beyond that, a small hut sits back from the edge, wooden walls, a thatched roof, laundry hanging in the breeze. Smoke rises from behind it, slow and straight. Someone still lives here, maybe several someones, and not just lives, thrives. There's a movement now, small but growing, of people returning to the chinampas not just as farmers, but as caretakers. Artists, ecologists, teachers. Some run workshops on ancestral agriculture. Others host floating classrooms. One man reportedly grows rare varieties of corn here just to keep their DNA alive. They're not reenactors, they're stewards. You drift past another canoe now, smaller and covered with a tarp. Inside there's a pile of squash, a sack of limes and a single sunflower in a glass bottle. Delivery maybe, or a thank you gift from one chinampero to another. You want to believe it's the latter. Up ahead the channel curves again. The trees form a soft tunnel overhead. Your guide doesn't say anything, but he doesn't need to. You're already imagining what it's like to spend a whole life here. Not just a visit. A lifetime of mornings among the reeds, of afternoons under fig trees, of dusk settling over water like a blanket. You wonder if the rhythm would change you, if the stillness would seep into your bones, if one day you'd stop noticing the mud on your hands and start missing it when it's gone. There's something romantic about it, of course, but also something solid, real. Mud isn't abstract. Tomatoes aren't theoretical. Even in a system this elegant, it's still labour. Still sunburns and mosquitoes and arguments about canal depth. But somehow that makes it more beautiful. You pass one last clearing before the trees close in again. A child is crouched by the water's edge, tossing pebbles in one by one. With each splash the ripples reach outward, small circles brushing gently against your boat as you drift by. And just like that, you're connected. The canal widens again and suddenly it's louder. Not with noise, but with life. You pass a flock of ducks gliding in formation, a young boy paddling a canoe with more enthusiasm than direction, and a chinampa bursting with zinnias, dahlias and marigolds, bright enough to make you squint. The scent of flowers reaches you before the breeze even settles. This is Xochimilco in its modern state, not preserved like a museum, not pristine like a postcard, just alive. A little wild around the edges, but still breathing the same rhythm it's always known. You spot a trajinera in the distance, a flat-bottomed boat painted in bright colours with a curved wooden arch at the front spelling out Lupita in bold red letters. A family is on board, laughing, sipping something fizzy, taking selfies under paper lanterns. There's a man playing guitar. A toddler is dancing. It looks like a birthday party with a guest list that includes mosquitoes and very bold ducks. Your guide smiles. Domingo, he says. Sunday, party day. Tourism has found its way to Xochimilco. These trajineras are part of it, rented out for celebrations, anniversaries, even the occasional wedding. Floating fiestas. It's festive, sure, but for the chinamperos it's complicated. The canals bring in tourists, but the wake from those party boats can erode fragile edges. Loud music can disturb nesting birds, and sometimes there's trash. Cans, balloons, the occasional abandoned flip-flop, floating like a lost thought. Geographers still argue whether tourism is a lifeline or a slow erosion for Xochimilco's legacy. The money helps. The exposure, maybe. But the tension remains. How do you share a sacred space without turning it into a theme park? You float past a more subdued chinampa now. No balloons, no music. Just a woman kneeling among her herbs, plucking sprigs of epazote and stacking them carefully in a cloth bundle. A rooster struts nearby. A dog barks once and immediately regrets it. Here, the work continues. Quiet, steady. A few families, true chinamperos, have held onto the old ways. They plant by the moon, they dredge by hand. They still offer kernels to the water before planting. These aren't historical reenactments. This is survival. This is inheritance. This is what it looks like when a tradition gets passed down, not as a story, but as muscle memory. You pass another chinampa with rows of lettuce so perfectly spaced they look like green piano keys. Next to them, young men in rubber boots lift crates onto a boat. It's a food delivery. Not for tourists, but for city restaurants. A new economy is emerging, farm to table, chinampa to chef. Some high-end places in Mexico City now advertise ingredients grown in Xochimilco. The chefs visit, take photos, shake hands with farmers. It's agriculture elevated to art, and yet it's still mud, still sweat, still mosquitoes and water stains and finger-length worms that squirm up from the soil like surprise noodles. The poetry doesn't erase the labour, it just reframes it. You pass a sign nailed to a tree, "No tires basura." Don't throw trash. Someone has painted a flower next to the words, a little plea in paint. Your guide sighs and gestures to the waterline, where a few plastic bottles have gathered against the roots of a tree. It's not much, but it's enough to remind you that this place, for all its beauty, is still vulnerable. Geographers still debate how best to protect Xochimilco. Some push for heritage status, others for environmental reform. There are conservation groups, school programs, even chinampa adoption projects, where city dwellers sponsor a plot. It's hopeful, but it's also slow. You pass a floating greenhouse, a rectangular chinampa with transparent sheeting and wooden frames, like a half-submerged greenhouse raft hybrid. A young woman waves from inside. She's tending rows of herbs under filtered light. Another kind of resistance. Innovation folded into tradition. New life in an old vessel. Then your boat turns again, and you see something that surprises you. A church, tucked into a chinampa's far edge. It's small, adobe-walled, roofed in clay tile, and painted in faded pink. There's a bench in front, and someone has left marigolds on the steps. It's not part of a neighbourhood. It is the neighbourhood. Just the church, the water, the trees. It's easy to imagine it as a centre of something. Not a tourist stop, not a spectacle. Just a still point in a world that floats. And around it, chinampas stretch out like pages, each one a sentence in a very long, very quiet story. You hear music again, not the booming bass of a party boat, but something lighter, an accordion maybe, or a flute. It drifts over the water like steam, not demanding attention, just filling the gaps between willow branches and cattails. You close your eyes. Just for a second. You can almost feel the layers of the lake beneath you. The stories stacked like sediment. Celebration, conquest, silence, soil. A traginer passes behind you. Children wave, you wave back. And somewhere, deep in the roots of a willow tree, something old stirs and continues dreaming. The sun has begun to lower now, slipping behind the veil of willows and casting long shadows across the canals. You feel the air cool just slightly. The warmth still clings to your arms, but the breeze carries a new edge, faint, earthy, and a little sweet, like damp wood and crushed mint. And this is when you meet them, the last true chinampero families. Your boat pulls into a shaded canal that branches off the main waterway. It's quieter here. No party boats, no guitars, just the slow creak of the wooden paddle and a heron calling once in the distance. Up ahead, a family is gathered near the edge of their chinampa. A man in a wide-brimmed straw hat is crouched, inspecting the roots of a chili plant. Beside him, two young women are tying tomato vines to stakes. A child is sitting in the grass, drawing circles in the mud with a stick. You float past them at barely a whisper. They don't stop to wave. They don't pose. They're too busy tending to something that doesn't wait. These are the people who never left, who inherited not just the land, but the knowledge, the timing of planting, the feel of a healthy root ball, the sound of a chinampa settling after a rain. Geographers still argue whether true chinampa farming survived into the modern era uninterrupted, or if today's techniques are reconstructions of older practices. But spend 5 minutes watching someone like this work, and you'll understand. This isn't performance. This is fluency. They speak the language of soil and water without thinking. Your guide nods toward them with quiet respect. Ellos saben todo. They know everything. Not everything is spoken. You watch as one of the women leans down, presses her palm into the dirt, waits, then nods. No thermometer, no device, just intuition rooted in memory. She picks up a basket of seeds and begins planting without a word. Here's something curious. The chinamperos don't write down much. There are no official handbooks, no formal instruction. Everything is passed down orally, or better yet, by hand. You learn by watching, then by doing wrong, and being corrected with a look more powerful than 1,000 words. You pass another family further down. An older man with hands the colour and texture of bark is sharpening a tool on a stone. He glances up, eyes narrowing slightly as he surveys your boat. Then he returns to his task, blade against stone, rhythm steady. These farmers don't farm for show. Their lives are intimately tied to this place. Some of them live in small cabins on the chinampas themselves. Others paddle in from the edges of Xochimilco every morning, long before the tourists arrive. They grow vegetables for local markets, herbs for traditional medicine, and flowers for the Day of the Dead. Their lives are modest. Their work never ends. And yet, many of them are facing the same challenge: legacy versus livelihood. The younger generation often leaves. The city offers more money, more speed, less mud. Some chinampas are left untended, overgrown, returned to the wild. Others are leased out to schools, restaurants, or NGOs trying to keep the system alive. A few are sold off entirely, parcel by parcel, to developers who see only the land, not its story. Geographers still debate the ethics of turning chinampas into educational centres or ecotourism sites. Is it preservation or transformation? A way of keeping the gardens alive, or just another layer of performance over a fading tradition? But here, in this quiet channel, there is no debate. The gardens aren't staged, the people aren't acting, they're just working, quietly, patiently, like the generations before them. You pass a chinampa where a small shrine stands near the water's edge. It's made of stone and weathered wood, barely the height of your knee. A candle flickers inside. A single marigold lies across its base, recently placed. You wonder who they're praying to. Is it an old god? A family member? The land itself? You pass close enough to see a faded image inside the shrine, hard to make out. Maybe a saint. Maybe a water spirit. Maybe both. Here, lines blur. Religion, myth, memory. They braid together like roots beneath the soil. The light shifts again. A golden hush falls over everything. Shadows grow longer. A dog barks twice and then goes silent. Insects rise in shimmering clouds above the water, catching the last sun like motes of fire. You glide past one more family, a mother and son, seated on crates at the edge of their chinampa. They're eating something from a shared bowl. Tortillas, maybe. You can hear them laughing softly. The kind of laughter that makes you feel like everything, just for a second, might be okay. You don't wave this time, you just float by, quiet, as if intruding on a prayer. And maybe you are. Because this isn't just farming. This is reverence. This is survival braided into rhythm. This is the garden that doesn't forget. The canal deepens again, not in depth exactly, but in feeling. Everything becomes stiller, slower. The chinampas are more overgrown here. Wild grasses sway in the breeze, and the plants seem to have reclaimed their autonomy. Tomato vines spill over their neat rows. Papalo and verdolaga grow wherever they please. This is the other side of the chinampa system, the side that doesn't obey. Nature, you realize, doesn't retire politely. It resists, always. Here in the wilder stretches of Xochimilco, weeds have returned with a kind of quiet vengeance. And not just weeds, rats, invasive fish, pests. Things that don't care about tradition or legacy, or how long your family has farmed here. The canals themselves clog more easily now, with organic debris and plastic alike. And even when chinamperos dredge by hand, the water doesn't always cooperate. It seeps back in too fast. It evaporates too soon. It brings things you didn't ask for. Fungus, larvae, or a perfectly timed frog chorus that drowns out your frustration with charm. You pass a chinampa where much of the soil has washed away. The ahuejote trees are still standing, noble, stubborn, but the crops are gone. In their place you see wildflowers, mushrooms, and something that looks suspiciously like a rogue fig tree. It's beautiful. It's also technically a problem. Geographers still argue whether rewilding parts of Xochimilco is a sign of failure or renewal. Some ecologists support the idea, seeing it as a natural evolution of the land's own design, a return to its pre-human state. Others see it as loss, a symptom of abandonment, a sign that a careful balance has tipped too far. And yet, there's resistance too. You pass a floating structure now, almost like a raft, but with a small greenhouse mounted to it. Inside, schoolchildren are peering through magnifying glasses, inspecting lettuce roots and worms. A young teacher is explaining how water cycles through the chinampa. You can't hear her words, but the gestures say enough. This is not a relic, this is a classroom, and the chinampa is still the lesson. Many families and local groups have begun reclaiming neglected chinampas, not to farm commercially, but to teach. Floating eco-labs, native plant nurseries, community gardens, in some places even therapy spaces, where the sick or grieving can paddle into silence and press their fingers into forgiving soil. It's restoration, but with purpose beyond profit. You spot a canoe drifting slowly past you in the opposite direction. In it, a man is collecting duckweed, the tiny green flecks that coat parts of the water like velvet dust. He scoops it with a screen, piles it into a crate. It's not trash, it's fertilizer, high in nutrients, free, organic. He uses it to enrich the soil, to feed chickens, even to clean grey water on his plot. This isn't romantic nostalgia. This is strategy. You float past another chinampa and catch the scent of copal smoke. Rich, resinous, ancient. Someone is burning it in a clay burner at the edge of a plot. A quiet offering. The smoke rises in gentle spirals, curling around willow leaves like it knows exactly where it's going. This isn't performance, no one is watching except you. And now you notice another layer of resistance. Language. A few signs nailed to trees are written not in Spanish, but in Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica, still spoken in whispers, classrooms, homes. Words you don't recognize, words that the land surely still does. One says, Atl tla huelik. Water is life. You pass a chinampa where an elderly woman is harvesting quelites, wild edible greens that once fed armies and peasants alike. She moves carefully, placing each bunch into a woven basket. No plastic, no rush, no sound except the soft rustle of her skirt and the water against the boat. There are still scientists who visit Xochimilco regularly, some from Mexican universities, others from abroad. They test water samples, measure plant health, document erosion. But even they admit something. The knowledge of the chinamperos, those who never left, is deeper than data. One chinampero, when asked how he knows the soil is ready for planting, replied, "Because my hands say so." It's not anti-science, it's lived science. The kind that comes not from instruments, but from centuries of feedback loops between plant, person and place. And still, the rats chew roots, the algae blooms, the city grows louder, but Xochimilco does not bow. Not yet. You pass one last plot, this one ringed with tires to hold the earth in place, a practical, if inelegant, solution. On it grows maize, amaranth, spinach, and a tiny tree heavy with guavas. The chinampa dips slightly under the weight of it all, but doesn't sink. It's tired, but alive. Just like the people who tend it. Just like the story you're floating through. You round a gentle bend in the canal, and everything goes still again, like the world is holding its breath. The breeze hushes. The birds, for now, fall silent. Ahead of you lies a narrow stretch of water, where the reeds grow taller, where the chinampas are smaller and more spaced apart. There's a different feeling here, not abandonment, but mystery. You're entering the part of the gardens that many locals simply call el otro lado, the other side. This is where the myths begin to seep in. To your left, tucked between two small plots, a pool of black water shimmers under an overhang of tangled branches. You pause. It's quiet. A little too quiet. And then, a splash. Quick. Subtle. Something beneath the surface. Your guide doesn't react, but he does paddle just a little faster. Because this is axolotl territory. Yes, those strange, smiling salamanders. Pink or grey with frilly gills and faces that look like they're always up to something. Native only to this valley, specifically the lakes of Xochimilco and Chalco, the axolotl is more than a curiosity. It's a legend. The Aztecs believed the axolotl was the god Xolotl, who transformed into the creature to escape sacrifice. He didn't get far, obviously, and instead found himself immortalized as a permanent resident of the canal floor. Even now, these little beings are symbols of resilience. They can regenerate limbs, survive strange conditions, breathe through skin. Geographers don't argue about their symbolism, but biologists certainly do. The axolotl defies almost every standard of amphibian life, and yet it thrives, quietly, weirdly, in these waters. Or at least it did. You float farther in, watching the water closely. Axolotls have become rare, threatened by pollution, invasive fish, and habitat destruction. Conservationists work daily to preserve their shrinking range, even creating refugios, sheltered areas in the canals where the water is cleaner, the predators fewer, and the plants native again. Your boat passes one such area now. You can see the signs, reeds carefully trimmed, floating nets keeping carp out, platforms of duckweed and water lettuce creating a leafy veil across the surface. Somewhere beneath it, you hope, a tiny face is watching you with sleepy curiosity. And it's not just axolotls that haunt this water. The canals of Xochimilco are full of strange life, not just in biology, but in memory. Your guide gestures to a low tree where something hangs from a branch. A dollar, sun-faded, head tilted, stringy hair blowing gently in the breeze. You've reached the outskirts of La Isla de las Muñecas, the island of the dolls. It's one of Xochimilco's more unsettling corners. Legend has it that a man once lived alone on this chinampa and began hanging dolls in the trees to ward off evil spirits, or maybe to honour a drowned girl. The details shift depending on who's telling the story, but the result is the same. Hundreds of dolls, dismembered, weather-worn, watching. Geographers, no comment. Tourists, intrigued. Locals, divided. But as you pass, you realise that whether the dolls are superstition or statement, they belong here. They've been accepted into the landscape, just like the marigolds and maize. Everything floats, even fear. The shadows grow deeper now. The sun has dropped behind the trees and the air carries the smell of water lilies and damp wood. Somewhere in the distance you hear a flute playing, or maybe it's a bird mimicking one, hard to say. This part of Xochimilco doesn't clarify, it just invites you to wonder. And then, another marvel. Orchids. Not the kind in supermarket pots, but wild, delicate varieties. Some clinging to tree bark, others growing in carefully protected chinampa plots. One stands out, a ghost orchid, pale and strange, nearly translucent. It seems to glow in the low light, like something dreamed rather than grown. These rare flowers are part of Xochimilco's botanical history. The Aztecs used orchids not just for ceremony, but for medicine, dyes, even adhesives. Some varieties were considered sacred, others erotic, others medicinal. And now they're studied, cloned, propagated by conservationists trying to preserve what's left. You float past a plot where one of these researchers is gently tending a row of epiphytic plants strung on wire. They don't look like much, just odd roots and stems, but with time and care, they'll bloom again. A small miracle on a floating farm. Geographers still argue whether chinampas are better classified as agricultural zones or ecosystems. But in moments like this, surrounded by mythical creatures, spectral flowers and ancient trees, it's clear they're both, they're all. You breathe in. The air is heavier now, but not oppressive, just rich, like the soil beneath you, like the past still whispering. And just when you think you've seen it all, your guide stops paddling. The boat drifts beside a chinampa barely larger than a living room. On it is a single bench, a single lantern, and one young girl sitting quietly, sketching something in a notebook. You float by, unnoticed. Or maybe not. She glances up, then returns to her drawing. You see what it is, a dragon with axolotl frills, curled around a tree. Somehow, it fits. You drift on. The sky above you is dimming now, not in a hurry but with the slow certainty of water turning still. The birds have changed their calls. The trees, once rustling with midday breeze, now sway in long, drowsy sweeps. Your guide hasn't said a word in a while, neither have you. The silence feels earned, but your thoughts haven't stopped, not since you first floated past those oddly solid gardens that weren't supposed to float. And somewhere between the tomatoes and the dolls, a question settled in the back of your mind like a canoe brushing against a reed bed. How? How have the chinampas survived this long? You're not just talking about tradition or memory now. You're thinking scientifically, because for all the reverence and myth and poetry wrapped around them, these gardens are, at their heart, a hydrological marvel. And scientists, particularly those who specialise in resilient agricultural systems, are starting to take a second look. The basic concept is elegant: soil layered with vegetation and lake silt, rooted in place by trees, surrounded by water that acts as both boundary and sustainer. That alone should earn the system a spot on any modern sustainability whiteboard, but there's something more. You float past Chinampa, where a small sign reads Sistema Agricola Milenario en Acción, a 1,000-year-old agricultural system in action. It doesn't feel like hyperbole. Researchers have tried to replicate the system in labs and controlled trials. They study how the chinampas retain nutrients longer, how they reduce soil erosion, how they recycle organic waste, and, perhaps most remarkably, how they filter water. Yes, some chinampas act as natural purifiers. The aquatic vegetation planted in the surrounding canals, think reeds, water hyacinths, duckweed, pulls excess nitrogen, phosphorus, and even trace metals out of the water. The plant roots absorb, trap, and metabolize these elements. In other words, the garden isn't just feeding people, it's cleaning its own water supply. Geographers still argue whether this means chinampas could be used as scalable water treatment zones for modern cities. Some say yes. With the right planning, they could supplement wastewater treatment and reduce urban runoff pollution. Others caution that without regulation they might become overburdened or polluted themselves. Still, the idea remains tantalizing, a farm that feeds and filters. You pass a floating platform now, anchored beside a chinampa. On it are solar panels, a set of small pumps, and a banner that reads Laboratorio Comunitario de Permacultura, Community Permaculture Lab. A man in a straw hat is adjusting wires, while a teenager reads a sensor's blinking screen. This isn't some nostalgic reenactment. This is applied science with muddy boots. In another canoe nearby, a young woman lowers a water testing strip into the canal. She shakes it gently, waits, then holds it up against a laminated chart. Her brow furrows. She makes a note. It strikes you that many of the people saving Xochimilco aren't just farmers or scientists. They're both, and they're not working from scratch. They're starting with the most time-tested blueprint they could ask for: mud and trees. You float farther into a stretch of water where the chinampas seem almost to whisper to each other. Maybe it's the wind, maybe it's the science, maybe it's just the part of you that, after all this drifting, has stopped asking for proof and started trusting in roots. A canoe passes by with crates labelled with scientific abbreviations: NPK ratios, control plot 3B, humidity trial. The boatman is wearing waders and headphones. He nods at your guide but doesn't stop paddling. Research doesn't clock out early. You ask yourself, could this work elsewhere? Could chinampas be reborn in places like Bangladesh, the Netherlands, or New Orleans? Could cities floating just above sea level use this ancient system to manage water and grow food at once? Scientists at UNAM and other global institutions are already exploring it. Floating gardens aren't just a quirky footnote of the Aztec Empire. They might be a blueprint for urban resilience in the face of rising seas and collapsing food chains. But, and this is important, there's a catch. The chinampa system only works when it's cared for, not just maintained. Cared for. It requires human presence, attention, and, yes, love. Left untended, the plots erode, the water stagnates, the trees collapse. The beauty of the system is its sensitivity. It rewards patience and punishes neglect. It's not plug and play, it's mud and paddle. You lean over the edge of the boat again, watching the water swirl gently as your fingers trail through it. You see your reflection there. Soft, warped, just a suggestion of a face among leaves and light. The air has cooled. Your guide taps the edge of the canoe. Softly, twice. Not a warning. A signal. The kind of sound that says, "We're almost home." You let your hand drift one more time across the surface. Somewhere below an axolotl might still be smiling. The sky is lavender now. Not just darkening, but melting. Warm purple bleeding into peach and ash blue. The air feels thick with endings. Not heavy exactly, just full. Like the final note of a long song you didn't know was still playing. You glide past one last bend in the canal, and suddenly the trees thin out, giving way to an open stretch of water. Here, the chinampas are fewer. The plots sit farther apart. The lines between them and the water dissolve under dusk. Everything has softened. The paddle moves slower now. Not because your guide is tired, but because the story is winding down. And what a story it's been. You began on gently lapping water, wondering what exactly a floating garden even meant. You learned it meant persistence. It meant mud dredged by hand. It meant willows that root dreams to the lake bed and chili peppers that don't flinch at the sun. You discovered that the Aztecs weren't just builders of temples and calendars, but of ecosystems. That they wove their agriculture into ritual, their ritual into geometry, their geometry into survival. Their gods lived in the beans, their medicine grew in the reeds. And their legacy? It didn't die when the city fell, it floated. You floated with it, through the echoes of conquest, the silence of neglect, and the sudden reawakening of modern science poking at ancient roots with sterilized tweezers. You saw the last chinamperos still tying vines with calloused fingers. You saw schoolchildren testing water, researchers planting with reverence, farmers dredging canals at sunrise. And now you float toward night. You pass one last chinampa. No crops, no family. Just a simple altar. 3 smooth stones stacked atop a slab of earth, and behind them, a single ahueyote tree, its roots tangled and deep, its branches arching over the canal like a closing hand. Hanging from its limbs are bits of ribbon, a feather, a clay figurine, a cracked shard of mirror reflecting a sun that's nearly gone. No one tends this altar now, but someone built it, and someone long ago or last week stood here and left behind a whisper of belief. Maybe that's what the gardens have always been, a prayer said without words, over and over, until it grows leaves. Geographers still argue whether Xochimilco can survive the next 100 years, but out here, tonight, that argument feels small, because the water is still moving, the gardens are still breathing, and the roots are still holding on. As the boat coasts slowly toward the dock, the lights of the city begin to twinkle in the distance, faint, far away, like a second constellation. The contrast is sharp, steel and speed, noise and neon. The other Mexico, the one that rose from the bones of Tenochtitlan and forgot to look down at the water. You step out of the boat and feel the ground sway slightly beneath you, not because it's unstable, but because your body's adjusted to floating. You've been part of the rhythm now, just a little. You turn back for one last glance. The canal disappears into darkness. A splash echoes. A single bird cries once, then stops. And in the hush that follows, you feel something brush past your shoulder. Just a breeze. Or maybe a blessing. Time to drift into rest. Let it all fade now. Let the gardens slip away gently back into their layers of shadow and silence. The boat is tied. The paddle is resting. The water is still moving, but it no longer needs you to follow. Take a deep breath. Feel the softness in your chest. Let your body settle into the quiet that only comes after long stories, the kind told by trees and mud and water that remembers. You are no longer in motion, and yet the world around you still floats. The air is warm but cooling. The leaves above you rustle with that low, familiar hush, the sound of something ending gently without needing to be said aloud. The roots still grow, the chinampas still breathe, and in the hidden soil the seeds of something ancient sleep beneath your feet. Let them sleep. Let yourself sleep. Let the sounds of the day fall behind like petals dropped from a passing boat, small, weightless, fading. Let your mind drift like the canal at midnight, smooth and untroubled. Let the stillness rise slowly over your thoughts, one breath at a time. The floating gardens are quiet now, but they haven't gone anywhere. They're here, beneath you, around you, rooted and gentle, holding their place in the water, like they always have. And just like them, you are exactly where you need to be. Right here, floating. Good night.